News of the Times. The 1900 Beeston murder, Mary Ann Blewitt, found dead in her chair. Welcome to News of the Times. In the summer of 1900, a quiet street on the outskirts of Leeds became the scene of a grim discovery. Mary Ann Blewitt, a mill worker in her 30s, was found dead in her kitchen chair, her throat cut, her body undisturbed for nearly a week. Her husband Charles was nowhere to be found. What followed was a slow, methodical investigation, one that revealed a trail of misleading calm, a shaved moustache, and a missing man with a troubled past. This is the murder of Mary Ann Blewitt, and the case that stunned the village of Beeston. And in today's end of segment further particulars, Aberdeen's Nellfield Cemetery was meant to be a place of rest, but in 1899 it became the site of something far less peaceful. Allegations surfaced that the man entrusted with protecting the dead had been rearranging them. What followed was a trial filled with coffin lids, tampered ledgers, and a gravedigger with a shovel and too much initiative. Before we begin, like, subscribe and hype this video to help spread the word of our smallish but oddly determined channel to others. And do share it with that strange person in your life who collects Victorian mourning jewellery, refers to cemeteries as relaxing, and has a very strong opinions about moustaches. So, light a gas lamp, draw the parlour curtains, and pretend the faint smell isn't decomposition, but just Edwardian charm. You're watching News of the Times, where the crime is freshly historic. Background. Mary Ann and Charles Blewitt. Mary Ann Blewitt was a mill worker in her 30s, known in the Beeston community for her steady routine and friendly manner. She and her husband Charles had been married for about 4 years, living in a modest 2-room cottage at 7 Star Fold on the outskirts of Leeds. Prior to that, they had resided in Pullard's buildings on Beeston Common. Originally from Morley, Mary Ann had no surviving parents and only one known brother who lived nearby. By all accounts, she was diligent, respectable, and well liked. On her final evening, neighbours remembered her cheerfully scrubbing the doorstep and chatting pleasantly, a picture of ordinary domestic life. Charles Blewitt, by contrast, was a man with a murkier past. Also in his early 30s, he had once spent 11 years in America, where, according to family, he sustained a head injury that left him prone to confused or erratic behaviour. His mother described moments when he would appear to go clean off it, followed by a glassy, vacant stare. Charles had returned from America and eventually married Mary Ann. When employed, he worked in a local leather factory alongside her, but in the months leading up to the murder, he had become notably idle, something neighbours remarked on, particularly given his strong build. The pair were not known for loud quarrels, although some said they argued occasionally. Outwardly, they appeared to be affectionate, but as later events would show, appearances in this case were painfully deceptive. It was a Sunday morning on June 1900 when landlord Thomas Armitage finally forced open the door of number 7 Starfold, a cramped 2-room cottage on the outskirts of Leeds. For over a week, the blinds had remained drawn. Neighbours assumed the couple who lived there, Mary Ann and Charles Blewitt, had simply gone off to find work in Barnsley. But inside the cottage, The air was heavy and still. A shawl had been draped across a seated figure in the kitchen. When it was lifted, what lay beneath sent the room reeling. Mary Ann Blewitt, stone cold, her throat cut, murdered in her chair and left undiscovered for days. The furniture and furnishings were undisturbed. There was no sign of forced entry. Her husband Charles was nowhere to be found. What followed was a story that sent ripples through the quiet village of Beeston. A tale of sudden violence, a shaved moustache, and a man whose troubled past may have come crashing back into the present. This is the grim discovery that started it all. From the Yorkshire Evening Post, the 18th of June 1900. Woman murdered a week ago, found dead in her house yesterday. How the grim discovery was made, husband supposed to be missing. What has every appearance of having been a brutal murder was brought to light yesterday morning at the village of Beeston on the outskirts of Leeds. The scene of the tragedy is a small, squalid, two-roomed cottage, and the victim, Mary Ann Blewitt, a married woman living with her husband, Charles Blewitt, who, like his wife, is around about 30 years of age. Mrs. Blewitt was found sitting in a chair with her throat cut, and the state of the body pointed to her having been dead for at least a week. Her husband is missing. The couple had been living in the cottage for about 7 months, prior to which they had resided in Pullard's buildings on Beeston Common. Blewitt and his wife were then working at a neighbouring leather factory, but soon afterwards the husband went to Barnsley, where he remained a month or two. His wife continued at the factory, and when Blewitt returned from Barnsley, he does not appear to have had any occupation whatever. He is generally described by the police and by his fellow villagers as being a steady enough man, though in view of his robust build, the neighbours were somewhat puzzled by his remaining idle. On the evening of Friday, June the 8th, towards 9 p.m, Mrs. Blewitt was seen washing the street door step, and her husband at the same time was observed to be in the house. The deceased woman was in a cheerful mood and passed several friendly remarks with the neighbours. Nothing more appears to have been seen or heard of the pair until the woman's dead body was found in the kitchen. Earlier in the evening of the 8th, however, Blewitt went to the shop of James Boshell, a barber in Town Street in Beeston, and had his moustache shaved off and a haircut. Boshell noticed nothing unusual about the man, and certainly attached no significance to his parting with his moustache, which is said to have been a rather striking one. When the next morning the window blinds were seen to be drawn and the door shut, the neighbours in the yard merely thought that Blewitt and his wife had gone off to Barnsley or elsewhere to seek work. Consequently, no attempt was made to enter the house until yesterday morning. The landlord, Mr. Thomas Armitage of Town Street in Beeston, first sensed something amiss a week earlier. He'd gone to collect the rent from number 7 Starfold, only to find the door locked and the cottage silent. A neighbour casually remarked they'd not been seen since Friday night, but in those days people often slipped away without notice to Barnsley or elsewhere in search of work. Armitage thought little of it. The next day Charles Blewitt's mother and stepfather appeared, asking if he had a key. They claimed the couple had left in a hurry on a bit of business and simply forgotten to leave it behind. Still, something about the visit nagged at him. The mother was insistent. She needed to retrieve something from inside the house. Armitage told her he'd open the door, but not before the rent was paid. She agreed. Later that day, with rent in hand and no working key between them, Armitage forced the door open. "Now, "You can go in," he said. What they found inside would haunt the village for years to come. The stepfather entered the kitchen and the mother remained outside. He walked up to a chair near the table and exclaimed, "She's here, right enough." A neighbour, Mrs. Russ, followed him in, and I also went in, still leaving the mother standing outside. Mrs. Blewitt was sitting on a chair with her legs stretched out and a shawl over her head. Mrs. Rudd lifted off the shawl and then saw that Mrs. Blewitt was dead, with a gash in her throat. One of the police constables, Freeman, who went to the house, said everything in the room was splashed with blood. The couple had apparently been sitting down to their evening meal when the murderer, whoever he was, committed the deed. The furniture was in no way disarranged, and the neighbours had heard no noise of any struggle. Upon getting to the place, Freeman immediately dashed upstairs, expecting to discover the murderer there, but without success. Up to 4 o'clock this afternoon, no arrest has been made. Charles Blewitt is 30 years of age, and his wife Mary Ann is apparently a little older than her husband. They had been married 4 years or so, but they had no children. The suspected man was born in Cornwall, but removed to the north when a boy, ultimately going to live at Morley. Here he made the acquaintance of his wife, whose maiden name was Jackson. The neighbours speak of occasional quarrels, but say they have never heard anything serious enough to arouse alarm or to warrant interference on their part. The woman worked at a mill in the district and followed her employment on the last day that she was seen alive. The house was ventilated as much as possible yesterday and the door secured by means of a padlock. Blewitt's stepfather struggled to reconcile the headlines with the man he thought he knew. "They always seemed happy," he told reporters. "I never once heard a cross word between them." But then came an unexpected revelation. Blewitt, it emerged, had spent over a decade in America and during that time had suffered a serious head injury. "Sometimes he'd just sit and ramble, like he wasn't even there," said his mother. "When he came back to himself, his eyes looked strange." Despite the horrific nature of the crime, there was real sympathy in the district for the Blewitt family, but with Charles still missing and the horror of what had been found in the cottage beginning to circulate, police could wait no longer. A wanted description was now issued. From the Yorkshire Evening Post, the 18th of June, 1900. The Beeston tragedy. The man who is wanted. Major Tarry, Chief Constable of Leeds, has issued the following notice. Wanted for the wilful murder of his wife, cutting her throat, on or about the 8th inst. Charles Blewitt, aged about 35 years of age, 5'6" or 7", fair hair, stout build and clean shaven. This man was last seen near his home in Beeston in Leeds at 8 p.m. on the 8th inst. when he called at a barber's shop and had his moustache shaved off. He is dressed in a suit of dark clothes, is a collier and has worked at the under-mentioned places via the Prince of Wales Pit, Pontefract, for 9 months, about 4 years ago, since which time he has worked in pits at Barnsley, Cudworth, Fryston and Morley. He is a native of Copperhouse, Cornwall, said to have been in America for 11 years. During the last few months he has worked at a leather factory in Beeston. He is thought to have had no means and may seek employment as a miner or in a leather factory. The accompanying sketch is from a photograph taken 9 years ago. The inquest begins. As the word of the killing spread, the official machinery of justice began to turn. At the coroner's court, grim details emerged, not from rumour or speculation, but from the mouths of family and medical professionals. What had been suspected was now nearly certain. This was no accident, no illness, no act of despair. This was murder. The inquest. At the inquest today, evidence of identification was given by George Jackson, Fettler, Valley Road, Morley, brother of the deceased woman. He added that his sister was 32 years of age and that he saw her at Morley 3 months ago. As far as he knew, his sister was living happily with her husband. Dr. Heald, the city police surgeon, stated that the woman had a deep wound on the throat, severing the windpipe and blood vessels. There was also a wound on the left wrist, severing the tendons. The little finger on the right hand was cut, as also was the web of the thumb. The injury to the throat was more consistent with homicide than suicide. The coroner, Mr. Malcolm, said that in view of the police investigations, the inquiry would be adjourned at this point, and the evidence was quite sufficient to point to murder. The search and a chilling silence. As the days passed, the investigation intensified, but the man at the centre of it all, Charles Blewitt, had vanished without a trace. Police combed the lodging houses of Dewsbury, scoured Wakefield and Barnsley, and questioned anyone who might have known his movements, but no one had seen him, no one had heard a word. And so the inquest resumed, without the husband, without answers, and with only the evidence left behind in that silent cottage. A shoemaker's knife, a sharpened razor, a blood-stained purse tied with string, and Mary Ann still in her chair. The case was no longer just a local tragedy, it was now a manhunt. From the Yorkshire Evening Post, the 19th of June 1900, the Beeston tragedy. The search for the missing husband. The Dewsbury Police District has been scoured in the hope of securing the alleged murderer, according to the descriptions which appeared in last night's Yorkshire Evening Post, but without effect. The lodging houses have been visited, and Mr. Midgley, Superintendent of Dewsbury Division, which embraces Morley, where Blewitt is supposed to be well known, has left no stone unturned to unearth the fellow. Constables are on special duty to secure his arrest if possible. Exhaustive inquiries have been made in the Wakefield district, both in the City West Riding Police as visit from the supposed murderer, but no information has been obtained regarding him. In Barnsley, nothing is known of the missing man's whereabouts. The police are making further inquiries. For weeks, Charles Blewitt had simply disappeared. A man wanted for murder seemingly vanished into thin air. But on a quiet Tuesday morning in Halifax, a workman at a local machine tool factory noticed something unsettling. The new hire, calling himself Oliver Jackson, looked eerily familiar. Not quite the face from the papers, but close enough to stir a memory. Detectives arrived swiftly, and they asked to see Mr. Jackson. He came forward without protest, calm, silent, and when asked, he admitted his true name was Blewitt and said nothing more. He offered no resistance, showed no remorse. In fact, on the train back to Leeds, he chatted with officers and laughed as though nothing had happened. Charles Blewitt was in custody, and soon he would be standing trial for his wife's murder. From the Leeds Mercury, the 4th of July 1900, the Beeston sensation, capture of the supposed murderer, Charles Oliver Blewitt, against whom a coroner's jury has returned a verdict of wilful murder, in respect to the death of his wife, Mary Ann Blewitt, who was found in a chair at number 7 Starfold in Beeston near Leeds on the morning of Sunday, June the 17th, with her throat cut, was apprehended yesterday morning at Halifax by Detective Inspector Bradley, one of the Halifax force. It will be remembered that, according to evidence adduced at the inquest, the accused man was last seen in Beeston on the evening of Friday, June the 8th, when, as it was supposed, the crime was committed. Nothing was then heard of him until yesterday morning, when, in consequence of a communication made to the Halifax police by a workman employed by Messrs. Redmond Brothers, machine toolmakers, Parkinson Lane in Halifax, Detective Inspector Bradley, accompanied by Detective Richardson, visited the works of the firm mentioned and asked to see a man going by the name of Oliver Jackson. He was accordingly sent for, and finding that his appearance tallied with the description of the alleged murderer, the officers at once arrested him on the charge of having wilfully caused the death of his wife. The man admitted that his name was Blewitt, but made no answer to the charge, and manifested very little concern over the matter. Blewitt gave very little trouble to his captors, and behaved in a very light-hearted manner on the journey to Leeds, entering into conversation with the officers and laughing freely. He had remained clean-shaven and looked very different to the widely circulated prints of his photograph, which represented him wearing a moustache, and to have identified him solely by the latter means would have to be proved a very difficult matter. The fellow workman, however, whose suspicions had been aroused, is said to have known Blewitt at a time when he was previously not clean-shaven. Blewitt had been engaged as a labourer by Messrs. Redmond for about 3 weeks, and had proved himself an industrious workman. He assumed a very reserved demeanour, and rarely conversed with those about him. Soon after his advent, it was suggested that he was not unlike the wanted suspect, whose portrait had appeared in the evening papers, and his attention was called to an account of the Beeston tragedy. He stated, however, that he could not read, and did not appear at all perturbed by the remarks of his associates. Later on, he acknowledged that he came from Leeds, and when pressed as to whether he knew anything about the crime, he preserved a stolid silence. Suspicion was consequently reawakened, and information was given to the Halifax Borough Police. Blewitt lodged at King's Cross with another workman, and is spoken of very favourably by the tenants of the house, who state that his appearance was that of a respectable working man. He had always been genial and sociable in his manner, and although he created the impression that he was a single man, he made no attempt to deny the fact that he came from Leeds. Blewitt will be brought up at the Leeds City Police Court this morning on the capital charge. He has been identified by James Boshell, the Beeston barber, who shaved off his moustache on June the 8th. The evidence builds. As the hunt ended, the legal case began. At Leeds Police Court, the hearing into the death of Mary Ann Blewitt drew a steady stream of witnesses, each adding a troubling piece to the puzzle. James Edward Smith, a workmate of Blewitt's in Halifax, recalled that Blewitt, using the name Oliver Jackson, was evasive when asked about the Beeston murder. When confronted directly, Blewitt simply claimed he didn't come from that part of Leeds and that he wasn't much of a reader. Another workman, John Boyle, said Blewitt denied everything, even his marriage and his past in America, but Boyle remembered him looking uneasy. Suspicion grew, and eventually he went to the police. Back at the boarding house, Blewitt told his landlady that he lived in Leeds but not near Beeston, Another man at the workshop recalled finding a filthy parcel of clothing, a pair of drawers and a singlet, which he burnt without a second thought. Then came the arrest. Detective Inspector Bradley of the Halifax force confronted Blewitt at the tool works, and at first he insisted his name was Oliver Jackson. Then he admitted, "Well, my name is Charles Blewitt." When charged with the murder of his wife, he said nothing. In court, the grim details of the scene were laid out again. A blood-stained purse tied with string, a shoemaker's knife, a razor, a spoon and a table knife, both bearing dark stains, but no sign of a struggle. Superintendent Loveday testified that Blewitt's home contained a hatchet, a revolver and several newly sharpened knives, more than enough, as the magistrate dryly noted, for a massacre. Dr. Heald, the police surgeon, confirmed the worst. Mary Ann's injuries were clearly the result of homicide. The city analyst found blood on nearly every item brought from the house. And then a neighbour, Mr. Sidney, offered a final memory. He had overheard Mary Ann saying, "Go and seek some work," followed by the sound of someone falling down the stairs. Shortly after, Blewitt slammed the door. Charles Blewitt was formally committed to stand trial for the wilful murder of his wife. The question now was, would justice follow? In the summer heat of the courtroom, both prosecution and defence made their final fervent appeals. Mr. Banks, for the Crown, painted a chilling picture, the impossibility of a self-inflicted death so violent, so methodical, timed precisely with the husband's quiet departure, bloodstains on Blewitt's boots, no sign of another intruder, and a house now silent but for the damning evidence within. But the defence, led by Mr. Waugh, countered with calm logic and character. No motive, no sign of discord, a husband not fleeing but seeking work, a man shaving his moustache not to hide but to look younger for a job, and no proven murder weapon, only shadows, possibilities and assumptions. The jury listened, and then deliberated, and then returned, divided. No verdict was reached. From the Leeds Mercury, the 31st of July 1900, the Beeston murder, the trial of Charles Blewitt. The jury disagree. The prosecution addresses the jury. Mr. Banks, in addressing the jury, argued that if Mrs. Blewitt killed herself, she must have draped herself with a shawl after she had mutilated one wrist and then the thumb of the other hand, and then cut her throat. It seemed impossible such suicide should coincide with the departure of the husband from the house. The doctor had formed the opinion that the case was one of homicide. Who else could be suggested as the murderer but the husband? There was ample evidence against the prisoner, and on the other hand there was no evidence of anyone having been upon the premises after the prisoner was seen with his wife a quarter of an hour before the blinds were drawn down for the last time. Mr. Banks emphasised the fact that the prisoner's boots found at the house had large stains of blood upon the soles, and argued that the inference was irresistible that he had stepped into the pool of blood on the floor and afterwards changed the boots for a newer pair. The prisoner was not worthy of telling any one of his intention. Was it not too much to believe that such a fearful fatalism would overtake this man, that on the very night when he made up his mind to desert his wife and go and hide himself, somebody else should murder his wife? The defence. Mr. Waugh made an eloquent appeal to the jury on behalf of the prisoner. he commented upon the entire absence of motive for the crime. The prisoner was a man of 40 years of age who had always borne a good character and had lived on terms of affection with his wife. He argued that the prisoner, after being out of employment for some time, went away to seek for work, and in order to make himself appear as young as possible, shaved off his moustache. This he did openly and in the presence of people who knew him, whereas if he wished to conceal his guilt, he could have shaved himself, as he had been shown that he had a razor. The mere shaving off of his moustache was something which might have been done whether the woman had lived or died. Prisoner's conduct in remaining at work at Halifax after his attention was drawn to the finding of the body was utterly inconsistent with guilt. Moreover, if he had been guilty of leaving his wife with her throat, he might have been expected to show some anxiety to see the papers and to ask questions when the murder was mentioned, but, on the contrary, he never evinced the slightest curiosity. Mr. Waugh also commented upon the fact that there was no weapon produced with which the crime could be said to have been committed, but said there had been a white-handled knife seen by the constable when he first visited the house, and that knife had been removed in the interval between the finding of the body and the opening of the door. No one could have a motive as to the knife except the person who committed the deed. As to the theory of suicide, there had been no threats used, and there was no marks of a struggle, and all that was consistent with the woman having committed suicide. Altogether, it was nothing more than a case of suspicion, and he asked the jury to hesitate before pronouncing the doom of any man on such evidence as they had heard. The jury were absent from court for 65 minutes, and on their return the foreman intimated that there was no possibility of their agreeing upon their verdict. They were accordingly discharged, and the prisoner put back for trial, which will probably take place on Friday. Trial 2. A second chance at the truth. A week later, the question still hung in the air like the scent of dust and ink in the Leeds courtroom. Had Charles Oliver Blewitt just escaped the hangman by chance or by design? The public, unconvinced and insatiable, crowded back into the town hall for the second trial. The same faces, the same charge, but a new jury and another chance for the truth to surface, or to slip away forever. This time the prosecution changed tack. Less theatre, few pronouncements. Mr. Banks simply asked the jury to use their common sense. If Blewitt hadn't done it, then who had? Who else could have entered that quiet house, shared supper unnoticed, and then cut a woman's throat with such calm brutality, locking the door behind him and vanishing without a trace? The boots didn't lie, the change of name, the sudden new trade, the silence when questioned, none of it made sense unless... But again, the defence pushed back. No motive, no quarrels, no weapon with his name on it, just shadows and suspicion, and those, Mr. Waugh insisted, were not enough to hang a man. The jury listened again. From the Leeds Mercury on the 8th of August 1900, the Beeston murder. The Crown Court at Leeds Town Hall was again crowded today when Mr. Justice Bruce and a jury resumed the hearing of the charge of murder brought against Charles Oliver Blewitt in Beeston. The prosecution case. Mr. Banks was brief in his address to the jury. On the question of whether the case was one of murder or suicide, he preferred to say nothing, but to leave the jury to exercise their common sense after hearing the evidence. The question, therefore, was, who committed the murder the prisoner or another man? If it was not the prisoner, it must have been someone who got into the room after the prisoner had left that night and before supper was finished, or, at any rate, before the supper was cleared away, somebody who entered quietly. Somebody admitted, or a noise would have been heard, somebody so familiar and so well trusted by the woman that he had the opportunity of getting behind her and of getting the steel to her throat before there was any struggle. He left behind a pair of boots with blood upon the soles, and by a strange coincidence these boots fitted the prisoner and were the same tread as the boots the prisoner was wearing when arrested. The murderer must have locked the door from the outside, as no key was found inside. On the night of the murder, the prisoner disappeared, and Mr. Banks reminded the jury that he passed afterwards under an assumed name, and that he sought to work at a toolmaker's and not at a leather factory or coal pit, the kind of work with which he had been familiar. The defence. Mr. Waugh. The case, he argued, was not one of circumstantial evidence, but of certain circumstances which, when taken together, pointed to nothing beyond suspicion. There was absolutely no motive proved or even suggested by the prosecution. On the contrary, prisoner had every motive to keep his wife alive. They had lived on the best of terms, and during his adversity, when he had been out of work, she had, by her own labour, kept him alive. There was no jealousies, no drinking, and no evidence of prisoner's wife having been a burden to him. He had left home in search of work, and there was nothing in his conduct from the time he left home which was inconsistent with the fact that he had gone to seek work, or inconsistent with his innocence. The judge's summing up. The judge began by instructing the jury to dismiss any notion that Mary Ann Blewitt had taken her own life. This was murder. The only question was, who did it? If the evidence left them in doubt, the prisoner must walk free, but if they believed it pointed to Charles Blewitt, they were not to indulge in fantasies of some unknown intruder. No stranger had crept in, no unseen visitor had slipped past unnoticed. The murder had likely occurred on the evening of June the 8th, and from that moment Blewitt disappeared. He claimed he left to seek work, but why that night? Why, without telling his mother, whom he'd seen earlier that day? By June the 18th, the murder was public knowledge, and on the 19th, a workman spoke to Blewitt about it directly, if he hadn't known about it before. This was his moment to react, but he asked no questions. Another colleague left a newspaper on his bench featuring the murder and Blewitt's own portrait. He didn't look. Was it careful indifference or impossible ignorance? And when arrested on July the 3rd, the accused of murdering his wife, he showed no surprise, no protest, not even curiosity. As for motive, the judge reminded the jury that motives don't always come neatly labelled. The law asked only this: did the facts fit? The jury retired at 1:15 and returned into court at 1:57 with a verdict of guilty. His lordship said, "Charles Oliver Blewitt, this is a sorrowful trial, and after hearing counsel in your defence and what you have urged in your own behalf, the jury, by your counsel, have found you guilty of the crime with which you are charged. I have only to say I agree with that verdict. You will have an opportunity which you denied your victim of making preparations for your great change. It only remains for me to pass the sentence of death." Prisoner appeared quite unconcerned at the verdict and the death sentence, and walked from the dock with a firm step. There would be no commutation, no royal reprieve, no intervention from Whitehall. The Home Secretary reviewed the case and remained unmoved. The sentence would stand. And so, in the early hours of August the 28th, Charles Oliver Blewitt was led from his cell to the scaffold at Leeds. What mercy had been denied to Mary Ann in her final moments would not be extended to her husband. From the Gloucester Citizen, the 28th of August 1900, execution this morning. Cut his wife's throat, callous and indifferent to the last. Charles Oliver Blewitt, tanner, was this morning executed in Leeds for the murder of his wife at Beeston. The woman's throat was cut while she sat in a rocking chair and the husband disappeared. In Halifax, someone showed Blewitt's newspaper containing the account of the case and the portrait of himself, but Blewitt showed interest. On his first trial, the jury disagreed, but after the second hearing, lasting 2 days, he was found guilty and sentenced by Mr. Justice Bruce on August the 7th. Billington was the executioner. The condemned man was callous and indifferent to the last, and made no confession. He walked steadily to the scaffold, and the reporters were subsequently informed that the death sentence was carried out without a hitch. Further particulars. In Victorian Britain, death was a serious affair. Mourning was formal, gravestones were poetic, and cemeteries were considered hallowed ground, places where the dearly departed could rest undisturbed, ideally in their original pieces. So, when whispers emerged of graveyard mischief in Aberdeen, not by ghoulish outsiders, but allegedly by the cemetery's own superintendent, the reaction was a mix of outrage, disbelief, and morbid curiosity. What unfolded at Nellfield Cemetery was not your average body-snatching scandal. It involved wheelbarrows, ledgers, and a suspicious number of coffin lids. This, as the press delicately put it, was not standard burial procedure. From the Illustrated Police News, the 16th of September 1899, the gruesome cemetery scandal in Aberdeen. The trial of William Coates, formerly superintendent of Nellfield Cemetery, on charges of grave desecration and perjury, opened before the High Court of Judiciary in Aberdeen on Wednesday. The case excited great interest and the court was densely crowded. The accused tendered a plea of not guilty. Counsel stated several objections to the relevancy of the charges, arguing that the matter of violation alleged did not amount to violation according to the law of Scotland, and emphasising the distinction between a case of body snatching and the administration of a graveyard. The floor of the courtroom in front of the dock was strewn with productions in the case, consisting of coffin lids, plates, and pieces of decayed coffins, and, as the evidence proceeded, there was a sort of grim humour imparted to it by the gingerly weighing in which the officials handed the relics when they had to be shown to witnesses. Evidence was given to prove that the cemetery ledger had been tampered with in order to show that fewer interments had been made in single layers. That was actually the case. There had been 16 bodies in one layer. A retired police inspector described how he had seen portions of flesh thrown from a grave in which the coffins had been broken up. He distinctly saw the flesh knocked off the bones by a shovel. The bones of 2 separate bodies were all mixed together. The witness underwent a searching cross-examination by the counsel. He said that the smashing of a coffin at the bottom of a new grave meant that only a handful of earth would have to be taken away. That was a saving of labour, and was, he thought, the prisoner's motive in giving such an order. William Wilson, gravedigger, described how he took a body out of the coffin, cut it up with a shovel between the knees and the haunches, and then the pieces were taken in a barrow to a tool house. They were rolled in a mat and afterwards thrown into a lair. He told the superintendent he would do that sort of thing once too often. Coote told him he was not paid for thinking. Prisoner pleaded guilty. When the court resumed on Saturday morning, the counsel for the defence stated that the prisoner was prepared to plead guilty to 2 of the charges of violation of sepulchre and not guilty to charges of perjury. Sentence of 6 months imprisonment was passed. And that brings us to the end of today's case. If you found yourself gripped, mildly disturbed, or quietly whispering, "I knew it was the boots," do give us a thumbs up, a share, or a good old-fashioned hype. It's easier than doing a cheerleader leap and considerably safer if you're holding tea. Don't forget to pass the episode along to your favourite friend, family member, or elegantly dressed ferret. Yes, we see you, Nigel the ferret, in your tiny velvet waistcoat. On behalf of everybody at News of the Times, including our growing fan base of finely attired woodland creatures, thank you for listening. If you'd like to support more long-form episodes like this one, packed with original documents, forgotten details, and the occasional ominous rocking chair, please consider joining us on Patreon. Members get early access, bonus content, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they've helped preserve cases like these from the footnotes of history. You'll find us at patreon.com/News of the Times Historical Crime. That's all one word. The link is in the show notes. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, formerly a junior assistant to the Ministry of Mists, now legally barred from shouting, "Who goes there?" at pigeons. See you next time. Same misty alley, same slightly unreliable narrator.